PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. It's about time I caught up with events in the Sicilian Kalashnikov. Yes, that's the opening that I wrote a book about and published a Chessable course, and I'm delighted to say that several viewers have sent in games that they played with the Kalashnikov, inspired by the course and the book. So I'd like to show you a couple of those games. The first one was sent in by Valerie Barker, who plays her chess in the good old US of A. And she wrote me this message. Hi, Mr. King. Very formal. Good start. I recently played a Kalashnikov game thanks to your course where I beat a 1950 USCF player. I analysed and annotated the full game, and I'd love to have your feedback. I'm an aspiring expert chess player, and I play the Kalashnikov based on your book as my main opening choice versus 1e4. Valerie, very sound. And this was a really great game, actually. So let's go through it. So this was played in the Albuquerque Chess Club. White, Brad Langer, and Valerie Barker is playing black. So e4, c5, the Sicilian, and knight c6, d4, white goes for an open Sicilian, and e5. So this is the challenging move that I really like. So it puts the question to this knight, and already there are lots of pitfalls for white, actually. Or let's just say inaccuracies. There's only one move which really challenges black. And that's knight b5 that was played in this game. And then d6. So this is the start of the Kalashnikov variation. And the two main moves are c4, or as played here, knight c3. Now, already it's a slightly unusual position because when white makes this very natural developing move, the knight gets pushed back to not a very good square on a3 at the side of the board. Now, bishop e7, so that's the move that I recommend in the course. So the idea is that you don't play knight f6 yet, because that would be pinned. So you play bishop e7 first, and only then knight f6. Now, in this game, knight d5 was played, which is a fairly common move. Knight c4 is the most popular move, swinging the knight round to e3, but it does involve wasting a lot of time actually with that knight. But anyway, knight d5 played, and that gets challenged straight away with knight f6, so that threatens the e-pawn and also threatens to exchange off the knight. And white takes the bishop. So white has the two bishops, but you'll notice that, I mean, how many knight moves has white made? So this knight has made 4 moves, and the queen's knight went 1, 2, 3 moves and then exchanged itself off. So although white has the two bishops, black is ahead in development because you can castle very quickly, and white has to deal with the threat to this pawn. Now in the book I took bishop d3 as my main line, but once black breaks with d5, this is the classic break in the Kalashnikov. I call this in the book Liberation Station because it really liberates black's pieces. Black actually has a very easy game. It's not just about liberating black's pieces, but also that's a very nice kingside pawn majority which can be advanced to press white's king. But in this game, white played f3. And Valerie comments, f3 struck me as right off the bat pretty incorrect. But I wasn't totally sure how to respond. She says, part of me wanted to play castles, but she also thought that if castles, then c4 would clamp down on d5, which is possible. But okay, black gets play in other ways. So basically she decided to go for liberation station straight away. And I think this is a very sound move. A very principled move, actually. So white has to take this. And you can see that because f3 has been played, this diagonal is open. And it may be possible to play sometimes queen b6. It just feels a bit funny. Also, this square is a little bit weaker, although it's covered at the moment. So white goes for an endgame, c4. And the knight comes into b4. Well, that's a beautiful square for the knight. And white exchanges. So, I guess the idea that white had was that, the king is a little bit misplaced in the middle of the board, but actually it doesn't matter too much. Bishop e3, well, that threatens a nasty check. So king c7. And actually, the king stands very safely on c7 because the c-pawn blocks the c-file, and then black's development is pretty straightforward. Bishop e2 played, and bishop f5. So very nice development. Black wants to plant a piece on d3. That's the weakened square once c4 has been played. Rook d8 probably a little bit more accurate, actually. And the reason is that after bishop f5, white can stir up a bit of trouble with f4, trying to get through to black's king. But, black is still okay there. But I just think rook d8 a little bit more accurate. In any case, white did not take advantage of that and castled. And now knight ec6 played. I think it would be best to get that bishop into d3 straight away. That's such a beautiful square. After the bishop exchange, the knight heads for d3. It's a beautiful octopus knight. But knight c6, well, it turns out extremely well. And again, I think white should go for f4 just to try and stir up trouble. Again, black is probably okay there, but it challenges black. But instead, white played rather routinely, putting the rook on d1, covering d3. But after rook d8, I think black is now in control. Now, white played f4, but as Valerie says, this move doesn't have as much sting when there's no rook on f1. So bishop d3 played, excellent move. Of course, when your opponent has the two bishops, then in principle it's a very good idea to exchange bishops. And yeah, moves like bishop f3, well, e4 can hit the bishop on f3, and black just looks like really well placed with a piece on d3. So white exchanged, and that is a fantastic piece on d3. It's a beautiful octopus knight, and I think Valerie has exploited the weakness of c4 very well. But white is still very much in the game. It's even material. Well, it's an interesting choice. Could play knight takes b2. It starts to get very messy. But instead, knight ce5 played. And I think that just keeps things very much under control. So it looks like a sound move to me. Rook d2. Knight g4. Excellent move. Just, hitting the bishop. And that's already very uncomfortable. So bishop g5. The bishop gets pushed around. And knight de5 comes back. So just looking to exchange rooks and get control of the d-file. So rook d1, supporting the rook. And this is very interesting. Knight e3. So not afraid of a big exchange of pieces. All the rooks come off the board. Now this pawn is attacked, so has to be defended or moved. B3 played. Now, here is where I'd like you to have a think. I'm going to have a little drink. Cheers. Black to play. What would you do in this position? It's greatly simplified, but black still holds the advantage here. Cheers. Black to play. Knight d3 played by Valerie. Excellent move. And we have a double octopus position on the board. Now, how special is that? Not only do they look fantastic, but actually there's a really strong point to this move. So this knight covers f2 and this knight covers f1. So the king cannot come into the game. So just fascinating to see that these knights still manage to dominate the position. Even without the rooks, normally the great strength of an octopus knight is that they prevent a major piece from entering the game. But these two prevent the king from entering the game. So it's an unusual occurrence, but really powerful. So you can see that already, you know, this knight is threatening to come in to take a pawn. White played bishop f2. This was taken, and this wins a pawn by force as knight c3 comes in to take the pawn. However, the downside is that as the knight has had to head right for the side of the board, to the side of the board, that's given white's king time to take up a very strong central position. So the question is, can black convert this extra pawn? Let's have a look. King c7. Of course, you need to bring the king out. King d5. Ooh, take care. This king can come in. But knight c1 played, hitting a pawn here. Now, if king e6, this didn't happen. Now it's two pawns, and in fact, this should be good for black, because black's king comes up, and that's going to be, once the knight is hit, that'll be a second pawn, and that should be enough to win. So white played b4, knight d3, so continuing to attack a pawn, and now knight f4 check. So not only does it prevent white's king from stepping in to attack the pawns, but it also wins a pawn because of the fork. King c5, knight g2. So this is looking a lot easier. Two pawn advantage, and yeah, white's king has been prevented from entering the position. But still, there's a few little details that need sorting out. And yeah, this is tricky. Got to be careful. The king wants to come down to just guide that pawn down the board. So, you know, perhaps black could have played this a little bit more accurately, but still. Valerie gets there in the end with a nice little bit of calculation. Because in this position, the pawn runs, and just when it starting to look very scary with a knight check and the pawn advances, then of course knight takes. Give up the knight, and one of these is going to go through. It's too much. So nice little piece of calculation at the end. And the king, neither king nor knight can prevent the a pawn from advancing. So I thought that was a really nice game, a really thematic game. I'm going to come right back to this position after f3 and d5, liberation station. So in the book, I mentioned these very common themes like liberation station, the breakout bishop, the bad bishop bounce, the Trojan horse. Liberation station is very common. And you can see that it gave black's pieces activity. And what was interesting was, notice how that knight really didn't get into the game for a very long time. In fact, if we come back to, this position, the double octopus knights, you can see how that knight never really got into the game until it was much too late. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that when you play d5, that it does give black the chance to advance this kingside pawn majority. In this case, that wasn't the decisive factor in the game. It was black's piece activity that really decided the game. But it's something to bear in mind when you play liberation station with d5. So it's an absolutely superb game. It's so thematic. Really like that. So well played to Valerie. The other game I wanted to show you was sent in by Abel, or Abel. Pick your pronunciation. I think this was an online game. Curiously, the game also was played with 10f3. I mean, it doesn't look like a very attractive move to me. Now, instead of d5, as Valerie played, Abel played bishop e6. And white clamped down on the d5 break with c4. That's what Valerie was concerned about. But let's see how this plays out. Rook c8, because I think black does have counterplay here, actually. So when white has this so-called Marozzi bind with pawns on e4 and c4, you need to strike out against it, otherwise white has control. And knight h5 is a good start. Looking to perhaps spin in the knight here. So queen d2 played, covering f4, and then f5. White castled. Now in this position, it might be wise just to exchange here. Maybe even just bring the knight back to attack the pawn on e4, or it's possible to go in straight away with knight f4. I mean, I think black has reasonable play here. But instead, Abel played f4. Now, this is really ambitious. So black is going for a kingside attack, very much in the same vein as the King's Indian, except there's no g5, g4 pawn break. Black is going to play with pieces instead. Now, the only problem is that this pawn is basically a goner. But black figures, well, it's just one pawn, and I'm strong enough. The rest of the position is strong enough. So bishop f1, I mean, this is prudent. Covering g2, king h8, rook c1, knight h4. So black is really going for it. And now I think it must be best just to eliminate that knight. But white played king h1. Black kept going with rook f6. And now this is getting scary. c5. Rook h6. And the game finished with a clatter. Watch this. Now white is lost. Knight g3 check. That was taken. And now here we go. Queen takes bishop. Very nice. If pawn takes queen, knight f3 checkmate. So h3 and knight f3 and bishop takes h3. End of game. Well, that's quite clear that white's king is about to be checkmated on the h-file. What an absolute massacre. Now, I'm not quite convinced that that was completely sound. I think f4 is a little bit too ambitious, but as we've seen, highly dangerous. That was an online game played at the end of 2024. Fantastic stuff. So 2 very interesting games in the Sicilian Kalashnikov in this line with 10f3. One, I would say, very positional, very sound strategic game played by Valerie, and the other, a good old King's Indian crush played by Abel. Congratulations to both players. Anyway, if you're interested in learning more about the Sicilian Kalashnikov, that book is available from New in Chess. You can buy it directly from there. And also the course is available from Chessable as well. I'll put the links in the video description and in the comments as well.